All right. Today we'll be discussing Barney Riggs, a lesser known gunfighter who was so vicious that even the noted assassin Jim Miller gave him a wide berth. Originally from Arkansas, Barney killed his first man in Texas when he was still a teenager. He then disguised himself in women's clothing and fled to Arizona, where he continued killing. Matter of fact, it was Barney's violent tendencies that would earn him a life sentence over at the Yuma Prison. Sentence that was ironically cut short on account of Barney killing yet again, only this time to save the warden. And despite being given a full pardon and pinning on a badge, Riggs just couldn't seem to keep himself out of trouble. Make no mistake about it, the man was absolutely fearless when it came to gunplay. Barney never backed down from a fight, and he damn sure knew how to keep his cool when the bullets started flying. It was the rest of his life that was a total disaster. And in the end, it was Riggs' own temper, as well as his many vices, that proved to be his final undoing. But hey, enough with the preamble. Let's go ahead and get things started. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
Barney Kemp Riggs was born in Arkansas on December 18th, 1856. Family would head to Texas not long thereafter and settle in Bell County. And as fate would have it, it's right there in Bell County where a teenage Barney killed his first man. Turned out to be a total accident. Apparently, Riggs thought his pistol was empty, and he was quote-unquote only fooling with it when it went off and killed one of his buddies. As far as I know, he wasn't punished, but he would find himself at odds with the law just a few years later. I'm not really sure about the details. Apparently, it was over something minor, but the sheriff did show up at the family farm one day, telling Barney that he needed to come to town and answer some questions. And rather than do as he was told, Riggs instead ran out of the house disguised in his sister's dress. And he wouldn't stop running until he arrived at his uncle's ranch over in Cochise County, Arizona. Now, this is also around the same time when the Earps were feuding with the Cowboys, and while Barney would not play a prominent role, he would be briefly deputized by Sheriff Johnny Behan. For the most part, though, he earned a living stealing horses. He'd drive them south to Mexico, sell them, and then on the trip back north, he'd steal a bunch of Mexican ponies to offload north of the border. And it was during one such trip that he allegedly committed an act of what I think most of us would consider mass murder. Story goes that he and his cousin had quarreled with a group of Mexicans at a watering hole, 2 men and 3 women. And one thing led to another, and Riggs shucked iron and killed both of the men. Then later on, as they were headed north, Barney remarked that the women were likely going to snitch him out, so, according to said cousin, he, quote, went back and shot the 3 women. Full disclosure, but the only evidence we have regarding these killings is the word of his cousin. His first officially recorded murder wouldn't occur until the fall of 1886. That's when Riggs started hearing rumors about his wife having a little extramarital fun with his uncle's adult stepson, old boy by the name of Richmond Hudson. Barney confronted Richmond, but he denied the allegations, at least to Barney's face. As soon as he was gone, however, is when Richmond went right on back to bragging, saying that not only did he seduce Barney's wife, but he also wasn't afraid of him finding out. And yeah, you know what happens next, right? As soon as word gets back to Riggs, he rides out to the ranch where Richmond was working, laid an ambush, and shot him dead. Now I know what you're thinking. It ain't much of a crime for killing a man for messing with your wife. And I tend to agree. The only problem was how he went about doing it. Rather than face Richmond up close and personal, he simply dry gulched him from a distance. That being the case, Barney got a life sentence over at the Arizona Territorial Prison, affectionately known as the Hellhole of Yuma. To quote historian Robert D. Arment, up to this point, Riggs had done nothing to place him in the ranks of the storied gunfighters of the West. He was simply a killer, a back-shooting, cold-blooded murderer of defenseless men and women. Like many before him and after him, he would live out his days behind bars, die and be buried, unmourned, and forgotten. End of quote. And that likely would have been the case, had Barney not helped to save the life of the prison superintendent, Thomas Gates. You see, on the morning of October 27th, 1887, Superintendent Gates was attacked by several inmates, one of whom they got their hands on his revolver. Meanwhile, another inmate began stabbing Gates in the back with a butcher knife. Barney saw what was going on and sprang into action. He managed to pull the gun out of that one inmate's hand and use it to kill the guy who was stabbing Gates. Barney would later recall, quote, he threw up his knife and turned to run, so I shot him again in the small of the back. He ran a little further when Hartley, one of the guards in the tower, fired and broke his thigh. I whirled and caught the superintendent before he fell, put my hand over the wound in his back and held him until another prisoner came and we carried him to the house. And yeah, for his part in saving Mr. Gates, Barney received a full pardon. Kind of. Turns out a lot of the good folks there in Cochise County weren't all that happy about Riggs being sent back to them. So they petitioned the territorial government, basically asking that he be kept behind bars. Ultimately, the governor compromised. Riggs would receive his pardon, only on the condition that he leave Arizona for good, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, he readily agreed to. And by the way, what does that say about Barney's reputation? Cochise County's the same place that had Curly Bill Broches, Doc Holliday, the Clantons, the Earp brothers, and they were worried about Barney Riggs coming back to him. So yeah, I'd say this guy was definitely a handful. But as we just mentioned, he did receive that pardon. So it were that Convict 426 was released on New Year's Eve 1888, after exactly 1 year behind bars. And true to his word, he did leave Arizona. Ended up making a trip to California where he located his wife and son. But I guess her past indiscretions made reconciliation an impossibility, though he just left her ass there in Cali as he and his boy returned to Texas. It's there where Barney would start a horse ranch with his brother about 30 or so miles west of Fort Stockton. He even got married again, to the sheriff's sister, no less. Sheriff, by the way, was Bud Frazier, and if that name sounds familiar, it's likely due to Frazier being killed by none other than the notorious Deacon Jim Miller. We'll get to that in just a moment, but real quick, today's episode is brought to you by the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. But Josh, what's a Patreon? I'll tell you what it is. Long story short, Patreon's just a subscription-based platform that allows you to directly support your favorite shows. And as it currently stands, my Patreon only has one tier. It's just $5 a month, and that gives you both early and ad-free access to the entire back catalog of the Wild West Extravaganza. In other words, no more pesky commercials. You get each new episode before anyone else. You get to listen to the early embarrassing stuff, and it is very embarrassing. And on top of all of that, you'll have the peace of mind knowing that 20% of every dollar goes directly to charity. And yeah, I do post receipts right there on Patreon. You also get bonus content. Remember that discussion I had a while back with James Townsend from the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition, talking all about J. Frank Dalton, that Jesse James impersonator? Well, we had a similar talk recently about a little someone known as Beaver Smith. Yeah, that Beaver Smith. Crusty old saloon owner from Young Guns 2. Turns out he was a real person. Not only that, but James was even able to determine his true identity. We also spoke about his life before and after Billy the Kid. We veered into probably a dozen other topics. It was just a fun talk all the way around, and it is only available on Patreon. I also have a new series where I'm narrating the biography of George W. Coe. If you're not familiar, Coe was a player in both the Lincoln County and Colfax County wars. Matter of fact, speaking of Young Guns, remember that scene where they got into the shootout with Buckshot Roberts? Well, George Coe lost his finger in that fight. Dude lived a very long time, and he knew a lot of people. Not just Billy the Kid, but even gunfighters like Clay Allison. And he shared his story later on in a book titled Frontier Fighter. And if you'd like to hear what he had to say in my voice, that too is a Patreon exclusive. I actually just sat down and recorded chapters 10 and 11 today, where they talk about killing Sheriff Brady and the lead up to the aforementioned gunfight with Buckshot Roberts. Now here's the catch with Patreon, okay? On November 1st, I am changing the $5 tier. Or to be more specific, I will be adding extra tiers with additional perks. I know I said I was going to do this before, back in September, but I thought I'd go ahead and give everybody a little bit of a grace period. Plus, it gives me time to figure out how to get everything in order to make everything go smoothly. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is this. If you're already a member of Patreon, this will not affect you whatsoever. You'll be grandfathered in at just $5 a month for however long you want to support the show. You'll still have access to everything. For everyone else, though, if you want to get locked in at just $5 a month, you've got until November 1st. And you can get locked in right this second by heading on over to patreon.com/Wild West Extra. By the way, if you're not sure how to use Patreon, just hit me up and I'll guide you through it. It's not hard at all. You can still listen to each and every episode on your preferred podcast player of choice, or at least most podcast players. And if you're more of a YouTube kind of guy or gal, I am now linking every new video to Patreon minus the advertisements. Okay, so you do not have to watch the videos on the Patreon app itself if you don't want to. You'll have to go through Patreon, but it'll transfer you over to YouTube with just one click. No muss, no fuss, easy peasy. So what are you waiting on? Head on over to patreon.com/Wild West Extra to get locked in at just $5 a month with 0 commercials. That's patreon.com/Wild West Extra. Now, let's get back to the show. Okay, so when Barney first got out of prison, he was on his best behavior, at least temporarily. That said, it didn't take long for him to go back to his old ways. And that being the case, he would find himself under arrest on multiple occasions in the early 1890s, mostly due to being a damn belligerent drunk. Hell, at one point, he was even arrested by his own brother-in-law. Still, though, he did somehow manage to secure a job as a deputy sheriff over in Pecos County. Not that it improved his attitude none, as he would continue getting in trouble with the law. He was arrested by Texas Rangers in early 1894 and charged with assault with the intent to murder. Got off due to insufficient evidence, but he was arrested yet again just months later, this time for helping a prisoner to escape jail. And once again, Barney got off with a mere slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing over in neighboring Reeves County, where his brother-in-law Bud Frazer had hired the aforementioned Jim Miller as his deputy, despite Riggs telling him not to. I have discussed this previously. If you'd like a more in-depth account, you might want to check out the episode I did on Deacon Jim Miller. But long story short, he and Frazer's relationship would sour very quickly. Matter of fact, they'd even get into a couple of gunfights right there on the streets of Pecos. The beef would continue until September of 1896, when Miller found the then former sheriff in a saloon and blew his head off with a shotgun. Now say what you will about Barney Riggs, but he was not afraid of Deacon Jim Miller, not in the least. Hell, he even moved to Pecos with the express purpose of avenging his brother-in-law's death. The only thing is, Miller made himself scarce, and rather than face Barney all on his own, he instead sicked two of his henchmen on him. The would-be killers in question were Bill Earhart and John Denson. They confronted Riggs in a Pecos saloon, and Earhart even managed to get the drop on him. But you know how that goes, right? I'm reminded of Gene Hackman in Unforgiven. Remember what he told that writer of books and such? Being quick with a pistol, that don't do no harm, but it don't mean much next to being cool-headed. A man who will keep his head and not get rattled under fire, likely as not, he'll kill you. And yeah, despite being outnumbered 2-1, that is exactly what Barney did. Earhart may have been faster, but sure enough, he missed. At which point Barney put a bullet under his left eye, killing him instantly. Denson also managed to fire off a round, but he missed as well and took off running out the front door. So Riggs just coolly followed and shot him in the back of the head. And although he would later turn himself in, Riggs was ultimately acquitted in what the El Paso Times described as a clear case of self-defense. Now, like I mentioned earlier, as cool-headed as Barney was during a gunfight, the rest of his life proved to be quite the disaster. His second wife, Annie, filed for divorce around the turn of the century due to him being, quote, addicted to habits of dissipation and improper associations. And then, when they temporarily got back together, Barney lost his temper and tried setting her on fire. Sure enough, Annie was granted the divorce the following spring. Not only that, but the court ruled that Barney owed her $2,000 in child support, which he refused to pay. So as a result, his ex-wife made her son-in-law from a previous marriage, a guy by the name of Buck Chadbourne, a trustee in order to collect the payments. And when Chadbourne attempted to collect said payments, Riggs publicly berated the young man and whacked him upside the head with his cane. Skip ahead to April 7th, 1902. Barney was drinking over at Fort Stockton when he spied Chadbourne across the street, loading a wagon. So he very predictably flew off the handle and ran outside yelling obscenities. I guess Chadbourne wasn't all that keen in getting a second beating, so when Barney raised that cane of his in a threatening manner, the young man pulled out a revolver and put a slug directly in the veteran gunfighter's chest. Riggs would stagger about 100 yards before collapsing, at which point he was taken to the Kohler Hotel, where he died the following day at just 45 years of age, reportedly cursing Buck Chadbourne till his dying breath. By the way, if you've ever been to Fort Stockton, or you're planning on going, that hotel that I just mentioned where Barney died, it is still standing. In fact, Barney's ex-wife Annie had been managing the place ever since the divorce. It wasn't until Barney's death that she was able to purchase it outright, and she would continue running it all the way until she herself died in 1931, at which point it became the Annie Riggs Memorial Museum. And as far as I know, it is still open as the Annie Riggs Memorial Museum. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Barney Riggs. All in all, a pretty despicable character. He just happened to be really brave during a gunfight. Thank you so much for joining me. Till next time, try not to steal any horses, okay? Don't go setting your wife on fire, or anyone else for that matter. And if you absolutely have to hit somebody over the head with your cane, make sure they're not armed first. All right, till next time, adios.